refreshed. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Lynn Sorge-English is Associate Professor in Costume Studies at the Fountain School of the Performing Arts, Dalhousie University, Halifax. Dr. Sorge-English's teaching and research link 18th century material culture with archival evidence in an attempt to understand wider issues pertaining to clothing, the body, and its representation in society, class structures and gender, design and business, and meaning and identity in a historical context. Dr. Sorge-English received her BA in Sociology and English from Dalhousie University King's College and her MA in Costume Studies from New York University. She completed her PhD in History at Oxford Brookes University in the UK in June 2008 with a dissertation entitled Staymakers of London, Production, Consumption, and Body Transformation 1680 to 1810. Her dissertation was published by Bloomsbury in 2011. While in London working on her dissertation, she taught history in the Honours BA in Fashion History and Theory at Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design. She is the recipient of numerous scholarships, including a Canada Council Arts Grant A and a Killam Scholarship. She has also been a visiting scholar at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and has worked at the Neptune Theatre in Halifax and the National Arts Centre in Ottawa. She has presented papers at Colonial Williamsburg, Winterthur, St. Hugh's College, Oxford, the Open University London, and the Gallery of English Costume, Manchester. She's currently working on 2 book projects. One of these is a practical book that will demonstrate how to create 18th and 19th century understructure for the modern body, and the other will present a new history of these garments. In addition to her dissertation, Dr. Sorge-English's publications include Confluence of Identities, The Staymaker as Medical Practitioner in 18th Century England, that was published as part of Symposium Abstracts from a conference with the theme Medical Identities, Patients and Professionals, sponsored by the Association for Medical Humanities, their annual conference at University College Cork, Ireland in 2012. Constructing Identity, The Staymaker Forms the Lady in 18th Century Britain in Alison Brown, Historical Perspectives on Social Identities, published by Cambridge Scholars Press in 2006. 29 Dozen and 11 Best Cut Bone, The Whalebone Trade and Stays in 18th Century London, published in Textile History in 2005. Today, Dr. Sorge-English's talk is entitled, You Never Saw Such a Doll, Sculpting the Body Beautiful Through 18th Century Stays. Please welcome Dr. Sorge-English.
Thank you very much, Michelle. That was lovely. And welcome, everyone. I'm so happy you could all be here, and I'm so happy you all came back after the break. That says even more. Stays transformed the body into an idealized shape which changed at various intervals throughout the century. And you saw a lot of artifacts this morning, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen the exhibition. It's totally fantastic. And this, I hope, will follow on from that. What I'm illustrating here is that the shape of stays at the beginning of the 18th century were very linear and very angular and actually kind of masculinized in shape. And you will see a few paintings which will show you, and just pay attention to the conical shape at the very beginning of the century. The kind of stays which might have been worn under the garments in a painting like the one you just saw would be, or could be, something like this, which were completely solidly boned, absolutely no space between the boning whatsoever. And the only way the staymaker could figure out how to allow for the curves of a woman's hips was simply to slash into the fabric. And so this was in many ways very primitive cutting. And when you look at the pattern for these stays, if you were to cut each of these pieces out and put them together, you would see that there's absolutely no shaping between the pieces whatsoever. They fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, and they do not allow at all for the curves of the body, for the breasts, for the hips. Only through the slashing do they allow for the hips. But otherwise, it's simply a case that goes around the body as much as anything. Now, this changed through the century. And You can see here that, again, just pay attention to those stays could have been worn under something like this particular shape. These stays they have a stomacher, which would certainly allow for them to fit different bodies or fit the same body at different times. And the inside showing the tabs, I have found that you can date stays based on the way the tabs are actually finished to some extent. And the stomacher itself, you see the inside and the outside. And the inside, the one on your right, you will notice that there is a casing at the top. And the casing actually is for a busk. And the kind of busk that might have been inside there would be like number 1 or number 3. So would actually be three-dimensional in shape. And when you look at the Academy of Armory, Randall Holm was writing about busks as early as 1688. Made in length according to the necessity of the persons wearing it. If to keep in the fullness of the breast, then it extends to the navel. If to keep the belly down, then it reacheth to the honor. And this morning, Dr. Bruna actually drew our attention to that in the exhibition when he imitated bending over and said it's just about impossible when someone is wearing a busk, and he was absolutely right. This is the pattern for those stays, and you will see that there is just a tiny bit of shaping in them now. In the third piece, the curving of the third piece actually would join onto the straight piece beside it, and that would start to pull the stays into the body. They also have one horizontal bone across the top, so things were starting to change. And this is 1750 to 52. The shape was actually starting to become ever so slightly rounder over the breast area. This is the kind of stays that might have been worn underneath that, and they were so solidly boned they could stand on their own. They bones just side by side, again, and beautifully lined now. And what you see here is that inside things have changed, in that piece of whalebone you saw in the previous pair is now much wider, and it has been permanently shaped to start to give this pigeon breast, to which Dr. Bruna referred this morning and has come up several times today. And the pattern here, you can see now the piece of whalebone at the top has become much larger than it had been. And there's subtle shaping in the angled side of the front piece, which again, when it joins to the straight piece beside it, starts to pull the stays into the body. Now this became even more so. Here, these are slightly more rounded over the breast, but what you're about to see is a major change. And this is 1787, and you can just imagine this is that pouter pigeon shape that we've been talking about. And you can just imagine her breasts actually sitting in there. And the kind of stays into which they would have sat is this. And these are so solid that when you try to lie them flat on a table, it's impossible. They won't lay flat. And you can notice that the center front is splayed apart with some lacing there, but the lacing is merely decorative because when you look at the inside, there's a piece of that baleen across the top. It's impossible for that lacing to work. And there's also now a busk down the center front. And you can imagine with a shape that rounded and that solid, that it would be entirely possible for the breast to just sink into there. And just showing the back. So these were only sporadically boned, but they still had this incredibly rigid shape. And the pattern there, now this morning, we talked about why it was perhaps that stays took on this pouter pigeon shape. And I noticed the label copy talks about the boning, and yes, I absolutely agree. But also, the shaping of the pieces themselves has something to do with this, because you will notice on the front piece itself, there is an S curve, and that curve actually goes from the side seam under the arm to very close to the center front. And when the straight seam is pulled into that S curve, it of course causes the stays to go into just under the breasts. and then come out again over the breasts. And so it's a combination of things. And of course, in addition to that, the actual shape of the whalebone itself and the kind of shape that would have ensued from stays like that is this. So by now, stays were very three-dimensional, really. And no longer were they linear and angular, no longer would they lie flat on a table. From then on, they became much lighter, as we saw in the exhibition, and they have the same kind of shape, but they now will lie flat on a table. The beautiful stitching, I mean, just beautiful stitching in so many of these pieces. A second pair, the same thing. Now, things changed again incredibly, and these stays actually were the beginning of moving from what I call a monobosom shape to a dual breast shape, where all of a sudden there were gussets inserted into these stays at the top, and once they were in there, the breast sat into them beautifully. And you can see the gusset here. And these are very early because stay makers, I contend, that stay makers didn't really know yet how to shape for a female body. Eventually, over the course of the 19th century, they figured it out. But this is the very beginnings of that. And you can see the half-moon shaped pattern piece down on the bottom. That is a piece that is cut much larger than the area into which it's inserted. And because it has those stitching lines, there would have been a drawstring through there, and that is what drew it in to shape the breast area, which is actually very clever indeed. And of course, that would have gone into that area in the front piece between the three letters. Now, and here is another one from pretty much the same period, much more lightly constructed with just gussets, which actually are, the fabric is just slashed into and a triangle inserted. And these now have semblance, these are stays in transition, both of these pairs, in that they have something from the 19th century and something from the 18th century. And I think that most of us find, historians have noticed, that very little just appears. It all comes from one thing and goes to another. And this is the final realization of the 19th century shape, in that there are two gussets for the hips now, so the fabric is no longer slashed into. Stay makers have figured out how to actually incorporate room for the hips in there, and the same thing for the bust. And this is a pair which Cora Ginsberg gave to me before she passed away, and they are invaluable. And again, you can see the gusset. I imagine these were never finished. It's quite likely they would have had a drawstring or something across the top because they're quite large across the top. Room for a bust, just a little bit of boning on the sides. And now, so that takes us to the 19th century, which is where I'm going to stop with this. But stays were worn by all classes, including the poor. The cries of London certainly show great street scenes and really help. This is a lady wearing a pair of stays with just her skirt, which was common among the lower classes. The kind of stays she might have been wearing is something like this. These were certainly designed, or I can't say certainly, probably designed to have been worn with a stomacher as well. And the lines, this is very heavy leather. The lines were, the boning lines were just scored in, not scored all the way through, so there were no bones in these stays whatsoever. And there you can see the scoring quite a bit better. And this is a pattern for the stays, and it does look as though they must have had a stomacher at some point, but very much like the boning of stays. When we're trying to find out exactly what happened with the lower classes, did indeed they wear stays? This is an example of, in 1721, Anne Pooley was killed from a boot in her back on Tower Hill in London. And then there's a description in this trial about what she was actually wearing, and you'll notice they knew her by her yellow stomacher, and she had on a leather bodice with that, in addition to all of the other clothing. But that occupied a place of prominence in the description of this particular case. And the kind of stays which a woman such as her might have worn could be something like this, which are from colonial Williamsburg. And you can see that the boning lines have simply been scored in. And these are really well worn. And you can tell that from the stress at the waist, for example, which it's very nice to be able to see something that has actually been worn to this extent. And the autobiography of Francis Place, he described his life in London. And he says, formerly the young women and old were seen emptying their pails or pans at the doors or washing on stools in the streets. In the summertime without gowns on their back or handkerchiefs on their necks. Their leather stays half laced and as black as the doorposts. So it could be something very much like that. And the lady here holding the chairs on the right, she could very well be wearing stays like this. This pair of stays are probably the most coarsely constructed and unrefined stays I was lucky enough to find. They were patched, mended, covered what looks like 1,000 times. They were really quite incredible. They have both black and blonde whalebone in them laid on top of each other. There's no specific pattern to the boning. It just looks as though the person put them together from whatever she had. There's a busk down the center. And the interesting thing is, though, that these were probably seen as being very fashionable because they have the lacing down the front, as you saw in the white pair, but the lacing was rendered immobile. It doesn't do anything because there was a busk that went from one side of the center front to the other. And so it's as though whoever made these and created them didn't really maybe understand exactly how to arrive at really fashionable stays. But it was a great attempt and is to be greatly admired. Now, stays were also worn throughout the life cycle, as we also saw in the exhibition this morning. Maternity stays, we might as well begin with pregnancy. So the ones in the top right corner with the lacing down the sides were for maternity. This is a pair of maternity stays with the lacing down the sides, so they laced there and could be loosened, of course, as the lady's tummy grew. And a better shot of that. Richard Viney is a staymaker in London who kept a diary in 1744, and it reveals so many things. It is amazing. And his wife had a child the year that he kept the diary. And he says, about 2, her labor began to come on. At 5, she gave up all hopes of being delivered. I'm sure she was in transition at that point. Because at 39 minutes past 5, she was safely delivered of a son, which ye 6th child and 5th son she has borne. And the kind of stays that he might have made for that child could be seen on this, the lady here on the left holding the child. And this is a pair of infant stays from the Cora Ginsberg collection. And you'll notice they have no tabs, but these are so tiny, 14.5-inch chest, waist 13.25, side seam 3.5 inches. They were probably for a baby no older than maybe 3 months, I would say. And of course, you just, if these are all drawn to the same scale, you can just see the size of the pattern. It's phenomenal. And stays were also worn by young boys, which I know many of you know anyway, until they were breeched between probably the ages of 4 and 8. And this is a solidly boned bodice, actually, which has sleeves in it, which was pretty common, and you can see there the pattern. A very interesting piece. Now, stays were also worn to prevent a child's body from growing deformed, at least according to staymaker Mrs. Lloyd Gibbon. And upstairs we also noticed in the stays or the bodice for a child that stays were also meant to keep a body not only erect, but to help with their posture, children as they grew. But they also were worn to keep a body from what they considered to be growing deformed. And in this case, Mrs. Lloyd Gibbon, who was a staymaker, she refers to the staymaker as a case maker, and she refers to the stays themselves as an anatomical case. And this is really just an example of the notion that they really did keep a body in shape. And these are the kind of stays which might have been worn, to which Mrs. Gibbon was referring. And here is the pattern. These are beautifully made. They, again, that curve joining into the piece beside it would push the stays into the body and really help to give them the shape that they ought to have. And again, Cries of London, you can see here that the stays on this little girl, you know, she might have been wearing those. And, you know, the idea was there were all kinds of people. This particular orthopedic surgeon, he advocated having 2 fingers. You had to be able to have 2 fingers between the stays and the breast of the child. Otherwise, you could harm the child as the child grew. And so he advocated changing the stays every 8 days. He felt the children grew that quickly. Well, now it's, you know, kind of unlikely that that would happen. And so maybe this is what happened more so, because this is a pair of stays which have had a piece added onto the top. So obviously, as the child grew, the piece was added to the top, and there you can see it much better. And I had the stays x-rayed. These were sent to me to Canada from Kenmore Plantation and Museum, and I had them x-rayed, and you can actually see the piece along the top. And then when I went back to Virginia, we had them actually CT scanned, and you can see the joining of the boning there. And it was put together, we had this analyzed, and it was put together with animal glue. Now, but stays were also used to correct deformities, so not only to keep them from occurring, but to correct them. And in this case, this is a plate showing what this particular German doctor felt stays did to people. And of course, there were all kinds of businesses sprang up all over the place trying to correct deformities in the 18th century. And it wasn't just building steel stays or anything for people. It was, you know, all kinds of things. Trusses to take care of men's hernias and neck springs and you name it. And people were bound up in one thing or another. And this just shows the text on the back of the billhead. These billheads are incredibly beautiful, and they really do say a lot about cultural life in the 18th century. This particular firm was in business for years and years, and all of their trade cards say pretty much the same thing. A little bit later they changed somewhat, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But you will notice steel bodice is in the middle paragraph. And the kind of bodice which they might have been talking about is this. This is definitely a pair of steel stays, and on the left-hand side where you can see the rust, that's all a complete piece of metal in there. And I have to tell you, these are also solidly boned. So solidly boned, first boning side by side by side, and then the steel inside that, and the steel hooks and eyes at the back. You know, this is a phenomenal thing. And if you imagine a child wearing this and trying to grow up wearing it, it's difficult to imagine. And the dotted line there on the back piece, it's the piece above that would have been completely solid, steel itself. But another thing to kind of notice is that there's a piece, again, these were fashionable stays, because there's a piece of whalebone across the top, which is a pretty amazing thing. So these were definitely meant to actually correct. So the fact that stays transform the body into an idealized shape is not really in question here today. We have seen that they were worn by all classes and by all ages, and that they were used to ensure that the body grew straight and to correct deformities. They were also used for posture. The question we're really asking here is why stays were so highly desirable to so many in the 18th century. This quote from the Duchess of Devonshire leads us toward an 18th century understanding of idealized womanhood. And just to come down to the bottom, she talks about how, you know, the stays took her body in and they were so uncomfortable. But, she says, it is the ton, and pride feels no pain. It is with these sentiments that ladies of the present age heal their wounds. To be admired is a sufficient balsam. The messages inherent in this passage are many. Number one, stays that were fitted to the body so tightly as to force the breakage of not one but two laces during the process of dressing in them would definitely have altered the natural form of the body in one way or another. Number 2, lacing tightly like this was not at all unusual. Number 3, the self-admitted discomfort caused by this sort of lacing invoked a sense of pride in the wearer's ability to endure the resultant pain. And number 4, the prominence of the breasts and narrowness of the waist resulting from a well-shaped pair of stays was definitely highly desirable to the wearer. Analyzing a passage such as this offers historians rare insight into 18th-century understandings of idealized womanhood and a useful basis from which to study the ways in which 18th-century women drew on contemporary British mores in an effort to fashion for themselves widely acceptable images of feminine beauty. Implied in the passage is the sense that the Duchess of Devonshire might well have enjoyed a feeling of superiority brought about through sartorial display. The interesting thing is, though, that she does not refer at all to the always seen and very visible outer layers of her gowns, but instead to something which was not on display at all in polite society, her stays. Yet her words clearly credit these same stays for the admiration she knows her clothing will engender when she goes out in company wearing them. As she says herself, to be admired is a sufficient balsam. It can easily be said that there appears to have been almost a total lack of self-consciousness in women's desire to attain an idealized and socially acceptable body shape. The strong sense of self that the Duchess possessed when wearing stays was almost certainly not limited to those of the aristocracy, though. Stays were so important to female self-identity that without them, a woman of any class felt incomplete. And yet, how are we to get at the importance of stays to self-identity for those of the middling and lower sorts, and even the poor? Since not every woman was as forthcoming in writing as was the Duchess of Devonshire, particularly those from other classes. The proceedings of the Old Bailey, which was the criminal court in London in the 18th century, provide richness like no other. And they are all online now, I'm sure many of you know this. While it might be thought that only those from the lower sorts appeared at trials, either as the accused or as character witnesses for their friends, in fact, people from every class appeared at one time or another, often as the victims of crime or as witnesses to it. Much was at stake at these trials for all parties, and so in addition to stating the facts, participants also divulged much of a personal nature, including their feelings. Rape trials are particularly valuable to our purposes, since much was revealed about stays and women. In the following case, for example, the rape victim, Anne Boss, was questioned about her state of dress when she was allegedly raped. In other words, did you bring it upon yourself? You know, we know that it was a historical fact for certain. And if we skip down to the bottom, were your stays ever quite loosed? No, they were not. When I got up in the morning, I did not stay to lace them quite, but wound the lace around. Stays often had the lace permanently threaded in the eyelet holes, and in the center, and if the center backs were laced loosely, a person could pull the stays off or put the stays on over her head, tightening the lace and tying it off at the bottom. Now this, of course, required a certain amount of agility and dexterity, but if one did not have the luxury of a maid, it could be done on one's own. The point is, Anne Boss's stays were so much a part of her self-image that rather than go without them, she preferred to put them on and wind the lace loosely around her body. Although the proceedings say nothing about Boss's occupation, they do make it clear that she had a maid. There is a strong likelihood, therefore, that she was from the middling sorts. The lower classes and the poor had a similarly strong self-image when wearing stays. Since few kept journals or wrote letters, consulting the Old Bailey proceedings is again extremely useful. In 1748, Hannah Boardman committed a crime, was arrested and taken into custody while she awaited her trial, unable to afford her bail. Upon finding her crying and desolate in the privy of the prison, Elizabeth Lionel, a fellow prisoner, offered to have someone bail her out if Boardman would put up a sum of money. Boardman had only a small portion of it on her person, and so Lionel, suspiciously I might say, asked her for her stays, obviously to sell. Boardman was torn between wanting her freedom and wanting not to part with her stays. As she put it, "How can I go without my stays?" She did decide to part with them eventually, but not trusting that Lionel would give her the money, she had her own child sell her for them and bring her the 4 shillings and 6 pence she received for them. A short time later, though, Lionel robbed Boardman of the money, so she took the money anyway. But Lionel was found guilty and sentenced to death. I mean, sentences were harsh in the 18th century. You can see that. These are just 2 examples of many references to women testifying in one way or another at the Old Bailey trials who indirectly divulged their feelings about self-image, which is really what we need to get at if we're trying to understand the lower classes and the poor wearing stays. Knowing that part of a woman's identity was derived from her own awareness of herself and that much of her sense of her own body was bound up with her stays, in essence, perceiving her stays to be an extension of her body, begs the question, how did women project body representation? Women of all sorts were aware of desirable body shape. A tension clearly existed between the image of the idealized human body clothed in stays and the reality of the human body. Bodies were of varying sizes and shapes, and although a woman might want and strive to have what she considered to be the ideal body shape, what was possible, the reality itself, was an area of negotiation between a woman and her stay maker. When stays were made on a bespoke basis, much was possible, though, and the woman could certainly let her stay maker know of her aspirations. Contemporary sources show that the stay maker did confer with his clients about their wishes. In 1796, for example, a society of adepts in the profession wrote the Tailor's Complete Guide, and one of the sections is on designing and creating riding habits for women. Discussing at length the proper way of measuring the female torso, the authors advised tailors to take their clients' opinions into account when measuring. Measure likewise from the top of the shoulder to the bottom of the stays before, or to what length the lady may wish. The client then had a say in determining how her body was to be represented in the clothing being created for her. The tailor took her measurements over her stays so as to design the riding habit jacket to fit snugly over them. Although this passage concerns measuring a lady for a riding habit, tailors continued to make stays and riding habits for women after females took over the making of mantuas around 1680. Which is also when stay making became a specialized branch of tailoring and a trade in its own right. The kind of negotiation taking place in this passage between the lady and her tailor would almost certainly have also taken place between the lady and her stay maker. Advertising also occupied a place of prominence in women's notions of self-representation, with billheads and trade cards playing a crucial role. The iconography on the trade card of Goodwin, milliner and dressmaker, illustrates the sight lines for taking the measurements of a female body clothed in a gown, which explicitly outlines the upper part of the body. At the same time, it suggestively hints at the shape of the lower body beneath the gown. The figure is almost certainly idealized in that the breasts are full, round, and high, with the nipples in the center. Moreover, the figure has a narrow but pronounced waistline, slightly rounded tummy, and full hips, and shows the promise of firm, rounded thighs, as suggested through the thin fabric of the gown. Many women seeing this attractive image would hope to resemble it in the finished garments being created for them by Goodwin, and we hope the same thing when we see the runway shows and models wearing clothes. In addition to acting as a form of advertisement for her business, the trade card sends a message of hope to her clients, indirectly offering them the unspoken possibility that their own bodies could attain this highly desirable shape. The mere act of hiring Goodwin to design and create stays and a gown like this suggests a concern for the projection of their body representation. But what about the lower classes? Did they too have control over their body representation? The answer, again, can be found in the Old Bailey trials. Elizabeth Leach, for example, purchased stays from a pawn shop in a very controlled and deliberate manner. On the 13th of June, between 1 and 2 o'clock, the prisoner came to my shop. She looked at some stays that were hanging up in the shop. She asked me if I thought they would fit her. I told her that I had half a dozen more pair indoors. I had no doubt I could fit her. I showed her some more. She tried 1, 2, or 3 pair on, and then selected one. This act might seem simple enough at first glance. But Elizabeth did not go into the shop and purchase the first pair of stays she came upon. Instead, she chose carefully from several pairs, but was not content simply to pick one pair from at least 7. She tried several on. The way in which her body would be represented while wearing stays was very important to her. And I have to say, in this shot, there are 4 pairs of stays in the window, and that is of 16 items of textiles here. So fully a quarter of them were stays. Therein showing that even in a pawn shop, stays were incredibly important in the 18th century. Women had some kind of relationship then, either with their stay makers or their providers of stays, and the process of acquiring them was one of sociability and of interaction between individuals. Stays, the production or acquisition, and the wearing of them were of social significance. Since this was the case, it is natural to wonder to what extent the design and creation of stays were affected by notions of seduction and eroticism. Were stays merely utilitarian garments worn because there was nothing else which had yet been designed to support the breast? Or did their design have any kind of erotic overtones? Moreover, did stays hold erotic connotations for the public at large? We have seen that creating body image in stays was to some extent an area of negotiation between a woman and her stay maker, but the balance of power almost certainly rested with the stay maker since, for the most part, the client possessed neither the skill nor the expertise to create a garment as complex as stays. Thus, the fact that the stays pieces were slashed at the sides from the bottom to the waist to accommodate the fullness of the hips is suggestive of womanly curves so full they would strain and tear the fabric if it were not slashed first in the making of the stays. The side pieces could have ended at the waist, but the tailor saw fit to elongate them to end anywhere from a few inches to several inches below the waist. Is it not possible that this was undertaken to enhance the seductive quality of stays? While this might not have been a conscious motive, it is unlikely that male stay makers would not have been aware of erotic overtones connoted through the wearing of stays. Valerie Steele has suggested that stays were associated with feminine erotic beauty because they exaggerated the sexually dimorphic curves of the female body. Moreover, there was a perception of stays in the 18th century as garments of seduction in representations in art, for as Steele has further argued, stays in 18th century prints within the genre of toilette galante, many of which featured stays being fitted by the tailor or of the female being dressed by her maid in the presence of onlooking males, were numerous. And let's bear in mind here that when a woman first came to her stay maker, she would be wearing only the shift, which was a long body which often came down mid-calf. It was very loose. It did not outline her shape at all, but it was often made from very fine linen. And I'm sure that in some cases the shape of the body could be seen dimly beneath it. Then, when the tailor started to dress her in the stays, her body shape took over, her hips started to splay out and spread apart. The fingers or the slashing at the sides, the tabs rather, and they were definitely, they were seen as erotic in many instances. And you can see here, without even the presence of an onlooking male, here the stay maker appears to have kind of lecherous intent. And you'll notice, look at the placement of his hands here, this leaves very little to the imagination. In fact, well-known painters also portrayed women wearing stays as objects of seduction. The Lecherous Monk by British painter Francis Hayman is a case in point. It has been suggested that it depicts Sir Francis Dashwood, who founded a club, the Knights of St. Francis, whose members met to act out their licentious play acting. Julie Peakman suggests that separating fact from fiction regarding the activities of the club is one of the problems associated with its history, but regardless of Hayman's intentions in painting the scene, the painting unquestionably contains erotic overtones. William Hogarth was an artist who portrayed stays as garments of seduction as well, for in many of his paintings, which are suggestive of intimacy or of lovemaking, the stays are in the room, but they're lying on a chair or on the floor. In this case, both before and after, they're there on a chair in both cases. So before, the lady has obviously prepared for the visit of her lover, and then after, it looks as though she's begging him, please don't go, but it appears that he's been spent and he is on his way. And Marriage à la Mode illustrates another scene of intimacy, although somewhat more dramatic. The Countess has been having an affair, and the lovers appear to have quickly removed much of their clothing before retiring to a night of lovemaking in the bed at the side of the room. Both her hoop and stays are lying abandoned, suggestive of the throwing off of clothes in an impassioned frenzy. And Hogarth's depiction of Plate 3 in A Rake's Progress further emphasizes this view. The figure in the bottom right of the engraving is preparing, bottom left rather, of the painting, this is not the engraving, is preparing to dance on the table and has begun by removing her stays. This time they are illustrated in their entirety, and the viewer can see their unyielding sculptural form, which lies in sharp contrast to the softness of the breast, which is now exposed as the woman leans forward to remove her stocking. It is difficult to imagine the hard mass of the stays surrounding the delicate flesh of the woman, but the viewer has no difficulty imagining the woman or her lover wanting to remove her stays as quickly as possible. Incorporating the removal of stays into foreplay appears to have been an important part of the ritual of preparing for lovemaking. Were stays not viewed as seductive garments, this most certainly would not have been the case. John Cleland's Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, written in 1748, but actually banned sometime later until something like 1969, is important to this discussion. Although Memoirs is clearly fiction, Cleland appears to have understood something of the erotic significance of a woman in stays, since his book is filled with references to them, and I mean filled. There is a group scene, for example, which the heroine, Fanny, describes in some detail. My gown was then loosened in a trice, and I divested of it. My stays next offered an obstacle which very quickly gave way. Louisa very readily furnishing a pair of scissors to cut the lace, off went that shell, and dropping my upper coat, I was now reduced to my under one and my shift. But if stays were perceived to be garments of seduction to the extent to which I suggest, the role played by male staymakers in making them thus, and the degree of consciousness with which they played that role, remains to be addressed. We have already seen the ingenuity and creativity utilized by the male staymaker in designing stays. Earlier, it was pointed out that certain design features of stays served to enhance the curves of the female body and were suggestive of the charms which were perceived to lie beneath the hard, unyielding exterior of stays. And yet the entire concept of stays lacing tightly around the body is replete with dichotomous notions which may not be reconcilable with each other. Firstly, the two-dimensionality of the rigid stays structure lies in sharp contrast to the three-dimensional soft curves of the female body, which are surrounded and entrapped by them. Secondly, the perceived seductive qualities connoted through the woman wearing stays can easily be contrasted with the image of propriety many women intended to put forward when wearing them. Stays were often perceived as garments of eroticism, but they were also seen as garments of respectability. It is possible that for many women, stays held dual agency. On the one hand, women enjoyed the respectability accorded them when wearing stays, while on the other hand, they also appreciated the seductive qualities inherent in them in certain circumstances. Thirdly, the linear and angular and somewhat masculinized form of stays is not in keeping with the feminine aesthetic image that stays designers were attempting and undoubtedly intending to put forward to the lady wearing stays. And lastly, from the perspective of the viewing public, the seductive qualities of the garments themselves are incongruous with notions of goodness and piety associated with the woman tightly laced in stays. But of greatest interest here is the role which the stay-making tailor played in setting the tone for all of these contrasts, and in particular for the seductive and erotic nature of stays. Prior to circa 1775, stays had little shape and made few, if any, allowances for the female curves, other than for slashing into elongated side pieces to allow for the fullness of hips, as we've talked about. Breasts were compressed and raised for the most part, particularly in the first half of the 18th century. The resulting shape, which was repeated in the layers of the gown, bodice or jacket lying over top, was cone-like and rigid and bore no resemblance to the natural shape of the female body. So we've seen these paintings, and just one quick run through. You see the angular, linear, conical shape. Until, and even though the form of the stays worn beneath the gowns in these paintings belied the curved shape of the body which they encompassed, they were still perceived to be seductive and erotic, as demonstrated through the earlier analysis of Hogarth's and Hayman's work. And they're just two of many, really. But during the third quarter of the century, stays gradually began to change, as seen in these two. And then, as we know, these are the stays that were worn beneath these, and just some detail of this shot so you can see that curved piece that goes into the straight piece, which I contend is one of the main reasons for the beautiful shape of the stays. Regardless of this difference, however, there's little doubt that all of these stays had one thing in common. They were all considered to be seductive and erotic garments in certain circumstances. Yet those from the beginning of the fourth quarter of the century appear to have been designed even more so with seduction in mind. Based on the observation that they enhanced the curvaceousness of the female body, unlike stays from any other period. The fullness of the breasts was accentuated by the narrowness of the waist and the fullness of the skirt, making the body appear to be perhaps even more voluptuous than it actually was. Yet, there is a paradox here. For although stays of this design draw attention to the full curves of the female body, and the diaphanous quality of the fabric of the gowns is suggestive of femininity, we also see that stays from this period are actually even more masculinized in form, in that they are more solid. But what happened with the seduction and eroticism of stays once females began designing them? Did it make any difference? We hear so much about male stay makers, but there were also females. Females gradually began designing and creating stays during the last 2 decades of the 18th century, eventually taking over from male stay makers. This is the subject of a larger discussion, and for now, suffice it to say that it was around the same time that stays design became more sympathetic to the female form. In addition to being created from only 2 layers of fabric and being only lightly boned, the stays made allowance for the curves of the breast, tummy, and hips in the shaping of the pieces. And although the insertion of breast gussets and later hip gussets resulted in this shape, the result was stays which accentuated for the first time not only the curves of the breasts overall, but the 3-dimensionality of each breast. Prior to this, the breast silhouette in stays was seen as one, more so as one might call a monobosom. When females began inserting gussets for the breast to sit into, however, each breast became a separate entity. The enhanced bosom brought about through the design of this type of stays can be seen here. And again, just to show you that it's the gusset itself which actually began this. And the cone-like silhouette of only a few years previous to this is nowhere to be seen in stays at the turn of the 19th century. Instead, the fashionable and therefore desirable body shape has become one of attenuated curves, rounded breasts, rounded tummy, rounded hips and bottom, and curved thighs. When the design of stays gradually progressed from the shapeless single bosom design of the 1780s to one in which gussets were inserted to accommodate the breasts, the total separation of the breasts became fully realized. James Gilray and Thomas Rowlandson, who were born within a year of each other in 1756 and 1757 respectively, were superb caricaturists with a sharp eye and a caustic wit. Their works show not only the gradually changing shape in fashionable stays from circa 1780 to 1810, but they also reveal just how erotic and seductive stays of this period were perceived to be. Among Gilray's prints, which are suggestive of his interest in unclothed bodies, is Female Curiosity. This depicts a brothel scene in which the harlot balances a huge wig on her bare bottom, viewing herself in the mirror held by her co-conspirator, who is dressed in tabbed, solidly boned stays. The stays of the harlot, kneeling on the bed, have been discarded and are lying on the floor, where their 3-dimensionality is clearly intact, the result of their solid boning. As Gilray scholar Richard Godfrey has said, this print is only one among several mildly pornographic, unsigned prints done by Gilray during his early years, but which apparently can easily be traced to him. This print also is pornographic to some extent. It depicts a royal liaison between the Duke of Clarence and the actress Dorothy Jordan. The print shows the lovers in blissful repose, with their clothes obviously having been removed quickly. And you can see her stays there on the right-hand side. This is something that's very familiar to many of you. Rowlandson did 2 sketches featuring stays in 1791, including a little tighter, showing the staymaker working hard to draw a closed a pair of stays on a rather large woman. And, you can see the suggestion there of it's hard, but you can also see her hips splaying out. And damp sheets, which show a lady and gentleman had been given a bed of damp sheets, from which they're wringing the water when they ring for the maid. Here the lady has removed her stays and abandoned them to the floor, where Rowlandson has drawn attention to their significance and importance by placing them in the foreground. He obviously appreciated the eroticism of stays and must have felt that females wearing them were aware of their sensuality. This is further demonstrated in his print Modern Antiques. Dressed in what appear to be stays, the lady, who is the young wife of the elderly gentleman examining the, this is a quote, half-concealed male organ, end quote, of an Egyptian statue, is keeping an assignation in a mummy case with her handsome young naval officer. The outline of the lower part of her body is clearly visible through the diaphanous fabric of her shift or gown, an indication of Rowlandson's view of the sensual and seductive nature of her clothing. The foregoing analysis draws attention to the fact that stays were viewed and experienced as garments of seduction and eroticism. We have seen that the design of stays was an area of negotiation between a lady and her staymaker, but the balance of power rested with the staymaker. I have also argued here that certain elements of stays could well have been designed with seduction and eroticism in mind, perhaps consciously or perhaps unconsciously. Regardless of staymakers' goals, though, there is another factor at play here which is even more important. Staymakers' transformation of women's bodies for fashion was actually more unintentional than it was deliberate. This came about mainly because the origins of staymaking are firmly rooted in tailoring. Tailors were adept at covering the male body with form-fitting garments which had been shaped to the individual body, and we certainly saw a lot of this in Dr. Bruna's talk, which was absolutely perfect for here. They were schooled in the art of sculpting fabric on the body. When the opportunity arose to create separate stays for the female form, around 1680, it is no small wonder that the garments they created bore a strong resemblance to 17th-century doublets. And this piece in the doublet there on the bottom, the rectangle or the triangular piece on either side, you also see that in many 18th-century stays, and it's card and paste or boned or something, but it's very solid. And even the shaping, the way the pieces fit together, particularly in those very early stays I showed you, is so similar to this. It's phenomenal. Moreover, the fact that tailors knew how to sculpt fabric meant that shaping a woman's body for fashion was not a foreign concept to them. As the century progressed and male tailors became staymaking specialists, their design, boning patterns, and construction became more sophisticated, culminating in the aesthetically beautiful and complex stays of the beginning of the 4th quarter of the century. The incongruity of the hard sculpted shell-like garments they were creating to envelop the soft curves of the female body appears not to have occurred to them. Furthermore, the masculinized shape and structure of the stays males designed is difficult to reconcile with the feminine aesthetic they were obviously trying to achieve. There is another factor to consider here as well. Staymakers were often so familiar with bodies that they were entirely comfortable changing their form and did it as a matter of course in a very unself-conscious way. A case in point is Richard Viney, staymaker, who lived in Yorkshire and kept the diary I referred to earlier. This diary is rich in detail of his life as a scholar and bookbinder and an amateur medical practitioner, among others. The point is, Viney, the staymaker, developed such comfort with bodies that he was able to lance a tumor on his wife's breast, Following childbirth, perform surgery on a boy's face after being kicked by a horse, and dress a severed finger, among others. Viney's skills as an amateur medical practitioner are the subject of a far greater discussion and fall outside the confines of this talk. But of import here is the fact that much of the information in Viney's diary reveals him to have been an artisan of the body. To borrow Sandra Cavello's term to describe tradesmen who were intimate with the bodies of their clients in late 17th and 18th century Italy. Included among them were wig makers, male midwives, and jewelers, and I would argue that stay makers fall very much within this same purview. Developing a certain knowingness of their clients' bodies made it easier to alter bodies structurally to conform to the fashionable ideal. And this Hogarth painting, which was unfinished, is perfect to illustrate the way he actually lived as a staymaker, because he actually traveled around and he visited clients in their homes and he measured them for stays. He stayed to tea. He ate meals with them. He spent the night because he lived in a rural area. That's part of the reason. But he was welcomed into the family as a friend, really. It would seem then that the attainment of an idealized physical form through the design, creation, and wearing of stays was anything but single-faceted. In fact, there were many players, only some of whom have been seen here this afternoon. The stay makers, including Richard Viney, those who wrote and did the artwork for trade cards and billheads, business owners, novelists, painters, and engravers, those who frequented the Old Bailey at any given time, but most importantly, the consumers themselves, who had stays made for them, or who bought them, or in some cases, even stole them. We as historians are still trying to understand the meaning of stays as material objects and their place of undeniable prominence within 18th century culture and society. Events such as this, including the wonderful exhibition outside and upstairs, bring us a few steps closer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I realized I was remiss, sorry, just before we have Q&A. I should have told you that the galleries will remain open between 5 and 7 p.m. So if you would like to go over and see the exhibition after we disband here, please feel free to do so. Questions for Lynn?
Or if we want to just move on, since it's 4 o'clock and I'm worried about our next presenter. Yes.
Yeah, Tay.
Oh, sure.
Can you explain a little bit more about the terminology of stays and corsets?
Yes. Stays were an 18th century term, and corsets are a 19th century term. I think it's really as simple as that.
Okay.
Yes.
Did people ever give up their stays with age?
You know, they actually didn't. I have seen so many references to really elderly women wearing stays, saying, you know, I'm not going to get a new pair because they won't see me out. So I will just wear these until the day I die. They bought stays to be buried in. No, they wore them throughout. Good question.
I would just say that my grandmother was profoundly attached to her girdle. When that came off, that was it for the end of the day. You know, she wasn't going anywhere. So, I mean, it's not quite the same thing, but I mean, she did not give up her girdle towards, you know, it was like, and that was her public self.
Right.
Right?
Totally. Yes.
Is there any indication of number, how many stays were owned, or how often they changed styles as they progressed through age?
There's lots of indication about it, but I don't have the figures here at my fingertips, but a lot of that is actually in my book. I maybe a cop-out, but it is. But yes, there is. And it depends on the class, really. So, I don't know, Brenda, it's a question that's hard to say for sure. Carrie?
Have you found any evidence about whether stay makers might do several fittings for a pair of stays? I mean, how did they, because if they got the measurements slightly off, then you're in trouble, right? So.
They did do several fittings. And Richard Viney, you can actually trace the making of a pair of stays from start to finish in his diary. And he did several fittings. And he would put all the pieces together, and then he would just sew them together loosely at the seams, and he would go and do a fitting. If there was something wrong, he would come back and alter them. So there were at least 3 fittings, and he talks about delivering the final product and how delighted the lady was. And sometimes he had to alter them, actually, and they weren't quite as successful. So, yeah. Yes.
How about washing them, especially poor people, they just...
I have not.
Because they have to have 2 pairs.
I know. I haven't found any evidence of washing stays at all, and I think it's
I think
partly
sometimes
because
the woman
they...
just had one pair, she was really poor.
Exactly.
I mean, she
And-
slept in them, got up in them. I don't think-
And I think it's one of the reasons they wore a shift next to their skin, and that theoretically absorbed the body's oils. Yes.
Can I ask, the phenomenon of the change in gender of the maker, is that something that's distinctly English and not French?
I don't know as much about the French. I really don't. This is really, but this is very definitely English, and I was really surprised to discover it. I was shocked, actually. I couldn't believe it. But you see, I think the reason it happened is because females had sewn the casings for the tailors, for the stay makers, the males. And so they became familiar with the bodies. They were there when they did the fittings. And so it was a gradual progression. You know, eventually some of them started to make stays for women. And eventually, and you look at the trade cards and you can see the progression start, you know, even around 1775 and go forward. Until by the time you get to 1800, there are not that many males left. It's really interesting. Yeah, good
And is
question.
that partly how you trace the transition in the stays from
Yeah,
more
the shapes.
heavily boned to more lightly boned?
Exactly. That's what I contend, that females knew about females' bodies. They knew how bodies felt in stays. So they were much better equipped to design stays for a female body than males were. That's exactly what I think it is. Isn't that amazing?
So, for instance, that pair of stays that you showed that had the gussets over the front, I mean, do you think those were made by a woman?
I
Or
do.
Can you tell?
I think they were probably made by a woman. And everything, you know, it was in transition. It was all a gradual progression. Nothing happened overnight. And as I said, they were, you know, in transition. So all of a sudden a female stay maker might think, wait a minute, the breasts, you know, I would like them to be more comfortable, so let's just separate them. Yes.
A question about the leather one that you found in Williamsburg. I mean, was that common? I mean, again, in terms of sort of thinking about how textiles would, you know, over time disintegrate versus something leather.
Well, one thing about leather that's great, it doesn't disintegrate at nearly the same rate that actual woven fabric does. But I have not seen very many leather stays. So they might be in collections, but I don't really know.
I mean, I
Maybe
think
some-
they're partly for lower class women.
Oh,
right?
definitely lower class.
And was the scoring to make them more flexible?
Yes, it was.
That was my question.
Yeah.
The scoring was just to make it.
More flexible. And it's amazing the difference the scoring makes, especially when they're worn and broken in. I mean, you saw the difference between the pair that had not been worn and then the ones that had. Phenomenal, the difference. Christina?
I'm going back to your previous point. I'm wondering if the transition between female and male stay makers might be the other way around, that as stays got less boned, you didn't need the strength to thrust the baleen into the casings, and so women could do it more easily, and that's why they got into
Well, you know, there is a school of thought that believes that males are the ones who actually cut the boning and drove them into the casings. But, you know, I don't know. I mean, it's possible that that happened, but it's such a coincidence that the stays actually took on more of a female form at the same time. And the early ones definitely have bones in them, like the white ones with the gussets. They're still quite boned. It was later that they weren't. I mean, you raise an interesting point, though, and it is something I'm going to think about.
Well, it
Thank
just
you.
meant, like, you know, mantua
Yeah.
makers, as you got less structure in the dresses,
Yeah.
women started to make them more than men, you know, so I'm wondering,
But on the other
Wait,
hand,
what do you mean, Christina, less structure?
well, when the mantua came in, that was, you know, not a bone bodice, it was the looser T shape. kind of
worn
structure.
over stays.
That-
I know
yes.
exactly what you're saying. And I'll
But
tell
women
you,
are making that.
yeah,
That's what I mean.
But that's what they were, the law said that's what they could make in France.
Well-
I mean, they couldn't make, they were, by law, they were prevented from making anything with boning in it.
Well, that's,
So-
well,
exactly.
and that is about what I was going to say, that in Britain, the mantua makers, or the people who wanted to make gowns for women, they petitioned the tailors, please, please, let us do this, let us. And finally they won. And it was the same in France, the same thing happened. So, I don't know if it's an interesting thing though to think about. We should move on, I think. I'm just worried about the next speaker. Thank you.